This will be Chapter 7 on assessment. How do we know what kids are learning? And it's really a change in education in the last 10 years, specifically the last 5 years. And one of the things that I'm going to ask you to pay particular attention to is some of these exact terms, for example, like norm reference test or standardized test and criterion reference test. At the outcome of this, you have to know what those are. You're going to continue to struggle with this whole aspect of assessment in teaching. Also, this will be one that's very important that you go on the wiki site and do your wiki part of the assignment, because all those lay out the different advantages and disadvantages. And I've had a little trouble with some of us not doing their part on there, and it hurts our overall body of knowledge for these different subjects. So Chapter 7, Assessment. Let's take a look. So in the last chapter of the second part of the textbook, Working with Students, it's Chapter 7. How do we know students have learned? And that's what I've been telling you all along in the course, that teaching and schools have changed, because now it's not about what you've taught, it's about what the students have learned. And hopefully we'll have a chance to look at that. What if students learn? How do you know they've learned? This is just out of your textbook. It's kind of how it's laid out, but we're going to talk about the purposes and then some of the key assessment terms, which you've done or will be doing in your definitions, and then that process and how do we plan it and what are some of the options. And that's how this is laid out. And these are some of the terms and things that I want that you'd be somewhat familiar with at the end of this chapter. It starts on page 172. What is that need to understand? Well, these daily decisions about progress. Why is that important? Because you don't want to teach a long period of time and not know that the learners are progressing, especially even one. It's a little bit different at the secondary level and stuff, but when you're teaching early on in those primaries, if somebody's not learning to read, you want to know, so you want to be making those decisions regularly, and you want to make daily decisions about the effectiveness of your instruction, because if one isn't learning, you've got several questions. Is it instruction? Is it students' inability to learn? Or is it the curriculum? And then student achievement scores are used to inform the public about the quality of schools, and this is how it's changed. Is now the public wants to know what they're getting for their money, and you got to be able to communicate that, and we don't know how to do that besides assign data. These achievement scores are used to inform the public about the relative excellence of the teachers, you, and performance evaluations and possibly teacher employment. Your employment can be tied to your assessments? You mean there's some accountability to this? Yeah, I'm a little cynical, but one of the things we tend to be in education is we don't want to be held accountable for learning. These are the focus questions. Let's jump in here. What is that purpose? Well, obviously determine student knowledge and use student achievement scores to inform the public about quality of individual schools, because now this may change, but as of now there's still school choice where students can move from school to school, and that has some things that people want to be able to know the quality of that school. And student achievement scores used to inform the public about the relative excellence of those who are teaching. And again, that's you. That's the purpose of this. And the students to evaluate the teacher performance. Accountability. Help to identify students who might have learning difficulties. And my special ed background, that's exactly what. We don't want to wait till the end of the first grade or second grade to find out the student isn't progressing. And you'll find as we go through this that grades are not a very good indicator of what they're learning. Help to determine the value of instructional materials, because what goes with instructional materials? Yes, a lot of dollars. And one of the things now that come into play are the computers. As we know at DSU, call them the tablets. Are they worth the money? How do we assign value? How do we understand the purpose of assessment? Inform others of progress of a student or group. Make decisions about the allocations of resources. There it is again. And form the basis for grading student evaluation. Because regardless, Our culture still hangs on to grades. Show me the A's. Okay. And the affirmation of successful students, one of the things we give them affirmation for is scholarships, a component of the instructional process to help reshape programs, professional growth for you. This is you. An identification and successful instructional approaches. In other words, how to determine what is successful without some kind of assessment. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but assessment means to quantify. Quantify means assign numbers. First of all, assessment is the purpose of collection of data from a variety of sources for the purpose of rendering a judgment. And this, again, is what we don't often like to do in education, is render a judgment. Just pass everybody along and give everybody a free pass. Let's be accountable. Let's make a judgment on students, teachers, curriculum, material, dollar, all those things from data, from numbers. And this is what assessment, when you get well versed in assessment, you'll be able to assign numbers. An assessment plan involves the identification of data sources and that are relevant to a specific set of learning outcomes. Sources for the outcomes. How are we going to get this data? What's reliable? And here it is. This is the term measurement involves quantifying. Quantifying means assigning numbers. And so you can compare numbers. And it's the measurement is that involves quantifying the presence or absence of a quality, a trait, or attribute. This is what you're trying to teach. You're trying to teach every student qualities, traits, and attributes. And so measurement is assigning numbers to that quality, trait, or attributes. And it could be the presence or absence also, because sometimes they're not learning. And learning isn't always a critique of the teacher, because there's three parts in learning. There is, obviously the teaching part, but there's the learning part and there's the testing part. The testing what's being taught. Is the learner learning what's being tested? And all these need to be interconnected. So that's what measurement is, quantifying a trait. Then we move into evaluations on key assessment terms. We had assessment, assessment plan, measurement, now evaluations. What are evaluations? Well, it's in interpreting. We talked about quantifying data. Now, this step is interpreting the meaning of that data. It is the intellectual process of making a judgment about the value or worth of something. To make a judgment, you must have a clear criteria. And there's two types of evaluation pieces. A norm reference piece, a criterion reference piece. Okay. Let me just say this is interesting here, the value or worth of something. This is what's changed also in our world of learning, especially we're being a connected world, is now there's all kinds of information out there. Billions and billions and billions of pieces of information on the internet. But what we need to learn to do and teach our students to do is what is the value and worth of all the different pieces of information. Because, for example, if you go in and ask Dr. Google what the word assessment means, you'll get 100,000 hits or more. And what your job is to do is determine the value and worth of that information. Let's move on, though, with the evaluation of this norm reference and a criterion reference piece of assigning value. Well, again, evaluation, a norm reference evaluation, and individual scores are compared to the scores of appropriate reference group. Okay, it's right here, compared. Norm reference are compared to a reference group. A common way to establish these norms is by reference to scores that are distributed along a bell-shaped curve, and this will forever be part of your world from here forward if you haven't already heard of this. This is a symmetrical curve derived from a mathematical formula. Yes, mathematical formula. What is a norm reference? You compare it to a reference group using a mathematical formula. It's a symmetrical curve against a mathematical formula. It's based on the assumption that any given trait, you had trait back here, right here, that a trait is something we've measured, that you've taught. Any given trait or ability is found in the total population in a distribution that is similar to the bell curve. So in other words, that if you are able to teach this trait or ability or a characteristic, that there's other people that have also been taught that. And so you can compare it against that population, that total population in a distribution. Most scores be grouped near the mean, which is middle, or the average, and will increase in frequency as one moves away from the mean in either direction. There will be less scores away from the average. In other words, there will be a few people on each end of the distribution with the numbers increasing toward the middle or the mean. Okay. Yeah, you know, Einstein was very dysfunctional at 160. He socially couldn't function, but was a genius. But here's what this means. Here's the middle. And this is typed on IQ. And you can put any skill or trait, as we said back here, any trait can be, right here, any trait or ability can be typed and put on a bell-shaped curve. So what this means is if you took the IQs of everybody that's ever taken this test, the average IQ is 100. And from that average, 70% of the people would fall between 1 standard deviation below and 1 standard deviation above. Okay? And this would be, we call low average. And of course, most college students function in here, and most teachers, and this is my rant, is we don't know these kids over here, but nonetheless, here's the bell-shaped curve. But as you get farther out, either way, there's less people out here. So 35% below, 35% above. 70% of people be in 1 standard deviation above or below. That's the whole idea of bell-shaped curve. So when you teach these traits, and if you use a norm reference test, where do they fall on this bell-shaped curve? And so you're only comparing them to what everybody else's score on that same trait, ability, or characteristic. Now, what are some other bell-shaped curves? When I took my babies in when they were born and they weighed them and measured them, they showed me where they were on the bell-shaped curve for height and weight. That's still a bell-shaped curve. My babies both were right at the 50th percentile. I said, guess what, boys? You're average, just like your dad. Okay? And somebody has to be average because 70% of the people are going to fall in this average range in all these things. You know, if we bell-shaped curve how much people could press over their head, there would be an average, and 70% of the people would be within that average range. That's what makes it average. That's the bell-shaped curve. Where do you compare? Where does the student compare to everybody else that's had that trait or skill or competency measured? So we're still in evaluation on standardized norm reference, and go to this standardized test, of which a term you're more familiar, and they're usually normed. What's normed? Normed was back here. Scores are compared to scores of appropriate reference group. That's what normed are. When you look at these scores, you should ask, how was the norm group selected? How should individual scores be interpreted? And when are the norms established? Because if it's a true norm, it keeps changing as you put more and more scores on here. The average should be changing from time to time. And this is one of the things like with No Child Left Behind. How do you establish and have everybody above average? Well, it can't be. If you understand a bell-shaped curve, not everybody can be above average, or the average moves. Okay. If you are to have confidence in the results, what you must determine is whether the group used to standardize the test has characteristics that's similar to your learners. So all these people, if you're teaching math, adding, do all these people have that same prerequisites as the one you're trying to teach? If curricula and learning conditions of the norming group And this is the norming group. All the people that are dotted on here are all the norming group. The group whose scores are used to establish those expected scores for individuals and take that standardized test very markedly from those tested group, the conclusion are be flawed. So in other words, you have to know for sure. For example, these people that are in this reference group for IQ, they all have the same kinds of backgrounds and experiences and age and those types of things. So sometimes it can be very misleading to compare the trait or skill you've taught to a reference group if you don't know, what is that reference group? How different are they? When was it? When was it last normed? Those types of things. All have to do with this norm reference test, standardized test. These two terms are somewhat interchangeable, but the only thing with norm means it's been compared to a group on a bell-shaped curve of some kind. And standard means it's the same test that everybody else takes. Norm reference. How about a criterion reference test? Well, criterion reference evaluations require judgments based on how the performance of each person compared to a standard or set of criteria rather than to others. Not to others, to a standard. Think of some things here that you would compare to a standard instead of to a group. Okay, I'll give you an example. The driving test. The driving test says you meet a certain criteria or you don't pass. We don't compare you to everybody else that's taken this test. We have a flat cutoff. And if you are above the cutoff, you pass. That's a criteria. How about a criteria for a math test? Let's say you have to get so many right before you go to the next level. That's criteria. Okay. Normed, criterion referenced, or set criteria. Could it be both? Could it be both? Well, let's say we did both. Let's have that thing say, I'll give you an example that uses both, is qualifying for the state track meet. If you reach a certain criteria, you qualify, or if you are compared to the other people in the race and you are in the top percentile of it, the other people that ran it, you also qualify. Sometimes for scholarships, reach a certain criteria, a certain ACT score or SAT score is a criterion thing, or if you're in the top percent of people that apply, you get the thing. That is using the same instrument for both. So it could be both, but in our schools, for the most part, it's not. We usually pick in evaluations. And then this is a part that you're going to have to read because it's very interesting on grading. A method of communicating. This is all grading is. Communicating evaluation conclusions. Because the grading system can communicate to students, parents, and school board members and the public, you must consider what your grading system is communicating and whether or not it's accurate or fair. Go to this page 177 and read this section on grading. I can't give you it all here, but it's an important part, and there's questions on the test about grading. And this is the video on the test, on standardized tests. And I'm going to have this on there for you about the standardized tests. I'm just going to give you one question today as far as the discussion board. And we'll come out here to this part. And we'll come up here to the discussion, and here's your question. What evidence do you think would be appropriate for indicating that a person is ready for college? And how about success? What would be a good thing that we could demonstrate is that they're ready for us to be successful in college. So there's a discussion question on the board for this week. Okay, it's a very good piece on the test. Well, let's move on to assessment instructions. And there is a number of ways that we'll look at this. The placement assessment, a formative assessment, and a summative assessment. And these are somewhat self-explanatory. First of all, the placement addresses the question of where do I begin? Purpose is to identify whether students have the necessary prerequisite knowledge and skills to be successful in a given unit of study. Now again, this really pertains to elementary because you want to know where in that spectrum to begin. It takes the form of a pre-test for the most part, pre-assessment, formed prior to the beginning of the new unit or course of study. To me, that is very self-evident. The thing that we'll see continually in our schools is that we don't always do this. We don't always have a predetermined spot. We let the textbook or the curriculum dictate without checking those prerequisite skills. Now the next one, the first was the placement assessment. Now the formative. A formative assessment takes place during instructional sequence. Basic question here is what you have to know. Are the students learning material? Choose to do this. Determine if the students are making satisfactory progress and if they need to modify instructional approaches. This is, get this, ongoing. This isn't at the end. You do an ongoing assessment. If persistent problems occur, then reteaching a subject seems to have little impact. You want to consider a type of formative assessment called a diagnostic assessment. And what does that do? It's a probe for specific causes of failure. It's what we do in special ed. What is the failure? What prerequisite skills specifically do they not have? If learners are making mistakes in responding to math problems, you might want to find out whether there is a consistent error pattern that reveals their lack of understanding of one of the basic conceptual procedures. And this diagnostic assessment is different than this formative assessment. Because a formative assessment tells you an overall skill, you want to back up into more specific what is they don't understand. So a difference. A formative assessment is, are the students learning material? Diagnostic, what is that specific cause of failure? These are, the formative is ongoing. Then the summative assessment takes place at the conclusion of an instructional unit or sequence. The purpose of the determined is summative means summarize. The purpose are to determine which learners have accomplished the objectives, the traits, they've achieved the traits or the skill or the competencies that we want them, and to provide you with information you can use to communicate to others what students have learned. The results of summative assessments form the basis of assigning grades. And this is more than one piece. This is looking from your pre-assessments, your pre-test, through all your formative, your diagnostic, up to summative. When you look at it all together in one, it's called summative. And from that you assign a grade. Or you reteach, they have to relearn. So this was an assessment instruction. Now we move into that next phase on page 181, planning for assessment. 3 steps in planning. First of all, define those educational outcomes. What should they be able to do at the end? At the end, I was telling you before, at the end you need to understand the difference between these different assessment pieces and answer questions about them. I'm defining for you what the outcome is. Now this gets a little more technical as classifying that. Some outcomes require your learners to do little more than recall names, dates, or other facts. And that's unfortunately how this class is run, as being an entry-level class. We just ask you some basic things. This is what I call a flyover. Okay. More complex outcomes, such as those that challenge learners to interpret, apply, and create, aren't always done. Those are higher levels. And for that, you need some kind of a taxonomies. You need taxonomies to figure out that. And the last step in planning is developing the criteria. So you define what it's going to be, classify it, and then develop the criteria for it. Well, let's move on and look at these taxonomies. Taxonomy refers to the classification scheme. Taxonomies provide a framework, that's another term you'll want to know, for addressing a wide range of educational outcomes. More than a few names and dates. Educational taxonomies emphasize 3 domains of learning. You've heard of these in any basic psychology. Cognitive domain, affective domain, psychomotor domain. Can you concentrate on all 3 in your teaching and your assessment? Well, that's what these taxonomies help you do. Help frame those things. First, Bloom's. Everybody's heard of Bloom's taxonomy. That's the most common one taught. And Bloom has these different levels of taxonomy. The lowest level is knowledge. It's just a simple recall of specific items or information. The next level is comprehension, requires the learner to recall specific information and also reflect on their grasp of the meaning by interpreting, translating, or extrapolating. But then we ask you to go to another level. This is where college students start to get nervous. The application, the ability to not only understand, but also to know how and when to use the information and solve problems. How and when. That's application. No, we're not done. We're only halfway through this taxonomy of Bloom's. Then there's the analysis phase. The ability to break complex information down into parts and to understand how the parts are related or organized. Then a synthesis level is the cognitive, okay, we're at a different level now, process usually associated with creativity, reverses of analysis. Can you do it from the other way? And the deepest level, evaluation, the act of judging something against a set of criteria. Does it meet criteria? Rarely do we take college students down here. This is what we ask you to do in grad school, is to come down in here. And this is straight out of your book. It's this cognitive process of Bloom's. Knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, evaluation. Please read this and understand a little deeper these different levels of cognitive process, 6 levels. And this is out of your textbook. So what would this look like? Like your learning objective first is to define the basic terms. The learning level is just recalling it. That's simply multiple choice. But when you want to apply that principle, then it's an application. That's when they have to show work, portfolios, entries. But let's move on. You've got to critique it at the evaluation level. Then you need to write about it. And then it creates a project. That's when you're analyzing it, performance stuff. That's how you set up this example. This is what we do with a lot of performance-based, is you have to show me. So here's another one. This is for the affective. We looked at the cognitive domain. Here's the affective domain. Croftwell's taxonomy. He said this. It's like receiving, showing awareness, and responding, making a response. Affective means that you do something and how it affects you. Valuing, expressing interest in it. Organization, integrating personal beliefs and attitudes to establish a hierarchy. And then characterization, making a commitment to it. Please read about this in your textbook. Affective domain, Croftwell's taxonomy. Croftwell's. Now, page 184, we moved into this. We said, what are these different things? Defining the outcome, classifying it, which we did with taxonomies, and now we're down here on developing this criteria. Well, these questions are out of your textbook. Again, you'll want to read this on page 184, but are the important outcomes assessed? And our criteria. Is the assessment procedure appropriate for the nature of the outcomes? Are they valid? Are there sufficient samples of behavior to allow for fair judgment? Samples of what is known. And do the measurement tools meet adequate technical standards? And again, your textbook takes you through these. Here's the questions in your textbook that you'll want to come in here and read this, because it takes you through the different parts of these questions that we're talking about for criteria. Do they meet adequate technical standards? Is this, are they reliable? Is it appropriate and developed? And again, there's questions on the test about this. Are the assessment procedures free of bias? Always a big thing is, is it biased to one group or another? Are the results of the assessment interpreted and used? Because sometimes we have assessments, but we don't interpret it and use it. Okay. So please come in here and read this. Developing criteria. Here's the biased, interpreted and used. Okay. So here, let's move on to something you're a little more familiar with, and that's these measurement options. This is something as college students and as students at all, starts on page 185, you'll know a little bit more about. Well, traditional measurement options sort into really two broad categories: a standardized test, which we've talked about, and now we move into something you're familiar with, is teacher-made assessments. Procedures of various kinds, including traditional paper and pencil tests, they have long been a feature of classroom life. Okay, so really those two options for this type of assessment. Standardized tests have the advantage of being written by test construction experts. Thus, they usually are free from serious design flaws. They all have some design flaws, but generally it's people that specialize in it. Individual test items typically have been carefully field tested if needed and revised, because the experts have the wherewithal to do that. When you prepare traditional classroom tests, you can select from options that fall into really one of two categories, and you'll know what these are. Selected response, mean that the teachers provided the response, or a free response measure. Okay. Two types of tests: standardized, teacher-made. Almost predominantly the most given test is teacher-made tests, that they make up their own tests. All kinds of variations around there, but standardized tests are less frequently. So, first of all, let's look at this selected response measures, including those tests require individuals to choose or select responses that are those provided. First of all, a two-response test items allows individuals to select from two possible answers which one is correct. Okay, what is two-response? Generally, it's this. This is one response you pick, or this. That's generally what two-response items are. The next is multiple choice, provides a stem of three or more choice answers. Okay, you know that. And then there's matching items, one list of questions, one list of answers. You know about that. Okay. Then this other thing we talked about, first of all, was the selected response, and now this free response. Require learners to generate responses on their own rather than select responses from a list of provided alternatives. And the most common test is the essay. Write about it. Okay. I'm not going to say a lot more about this because you're going to say a lot more about this. Okay. Let me take you there quick on all of these. On this program for this project test, here's what I've done here is you all are assigned a part of it. For example, Cassandra here is to tell about what a two-response item is, and then Jared and Kelsey will talk about the advantage and the disadvantage, and of course an image over here. And I have one down here that I've done a norm reference test. I give a little description about it, and I have a little image. But for the most part, all the way through here, you are describing, one of you is describing what it is, and two of you then, one's giving the advantage and disadvantages, all these different tests. So here's your two response, multiple choice, matching, free response, performance assessment, learner portfolios. That's what and you'll give what they are, then the advantage and disadvantage. And if you don't do your job here, there's a part of this missing. And this too, there's things on the test about this particular part. So please come in and do your part. So now let's move into a talk about performance assessments. Well, attempts to assess the performance of students on a realistic or authentic. We had this before. What is authentic task? Well, this type of assessment has been called performance assessment, authentic assessment, alternative assessment, like teaching versus classwork. That, we have you take all these classes, but it's not the same as teaching. that because you do well in classwork, and I've had this, someone that graduated with a 3.8 grade point and failed student teaching, because they're different types of assessments. Performance is you have to perform that, and just because you can answer all the questions doesn't mean you can perform or understand the task. Now, why do we have to have all these assessments if we can just go to this? Why do we have any assessments? Why don't we just take you out to do student teaching and evaluate you there? Well, wouldn't it be kind of harsh that if the first time you knew that you couldn't do this function is when you got there? That's why there's so many assessments along the way that you plan and do the ongoing formative assessments and summative assessments and stuff, is that you don't want to spend that much wasted time going towards an outcome that never comes. And how do you evaluate things like student teaching or performance-based things, a dance performance or singing or drawing a picture, any of those performance-based things? Well, you assign like scoring rubrics or rating scales or checklists. And this is all something for your assessment class that you'll be taking later on. But this is how you evaluate performance. And then there is portfolios, which are not brand new, but still some to our K-12 learners. Purposeful collection of artifacts and performance related to learners' efforts and progress. You identify that purpose, decide what should be in it, prepare the cover for it, and identify the criteria how you're going to evaluate it. And at DSU, as most schools, you got to have a portfolio to have a collection of these artifacts to be admitted to the College of Ed, and then to be sent out to student teaching. Okay, that's the portfolio. And this is interesting, the summary, and I want you to go through this summary because it summarizes very nicely. Grades are evaluation results. 2 basic orientations, norm reference, compare scores to others, criterion, comparing scores to individual learner against a standard, placement, formative, summative, define, classify, develop, plan, select response, free response or selected response, learners to apply, performance, purposeful collection. But here's what you're going to answer for me now in your notes that you submit. Reflect on your test taking experience, which type give you the most anxiety and why, which are you most comfortable answering and why. You can look at this, but you don't have to respond to this. But you must respond to this in the notes to get the full credit. There you have it. Chapter 7, Assessment. Now go show me what you know.